The fields lay still under a pale autumn sun, the kind that glows but never quite warms. A thin mist hung over the furrows, wrapping the horizon in a quiet that felt too wide, too heavy. The war was still being fought somewhere far beyond that horizon, across oceans, through smoke, over the bones of Europe. But here in rural Texas, the only battle was against the coming frost.
The farmer, John Miller, stood by his barn, staring at his idle tractor. Its rusted engine had given up halfway through harvest. He ran a thumb over the cracked metal, muttering something between a prayer and a curse. For a man who had already sent one son to fight overseas, every silence on this land carried an echo. The empty chair at his table, the broken tractor, both reminders of a world gone wrong. Crows gathered on the fence line, watching him. Beyond the hills, a faint whistle carried through the still air, a train, steady and distant. Few in town knew its cargo, fewer still cared to ask. But the rumor was enough. The government was sending them, captured Germans, to help on the farms. The same enemy faces his boy might have seen before the bullets did.
John turned his face toward the sound, jaw tightening. In every direction the land waited, patient, indifferent. The corn stalks, the dust, the sunlit fence posts, they did not know what side a man fought for. They only knew hunger and the need for hands to work. A few miles away, the local church bell tolled noon, hollow and slow. The town moved on with quiet suspicion, women drawing curtains, men lingering outside stores, spitting tobacco and waiting for something worth hating. But time had thinned out even hatred here. People were tired of enemies they'd never met. The whistle grew louder. Somewhere a dog barked. A boy pointed from the field as the first faint column of smoke appeared beyond the tree line, black, trailing against the soft blue sky. John watched without speaking. War, it seemed, had found its way even to this corner of peace. But there was no marching, no shouting, no glory. Only the sound of a train carrying strangers into a land already weary of conflict. In that silence, between fear and necessity, a new kind of story was beginning. One not about nations, but about people learning how to see one another again.
The convoy came just after dawn, when the air was still sharp and the dust hadn't yet risen from the roads. From a distance, it sounded like thunder rolling low across the prairie, the kind that doesn't bring rain, only warning. The townsfolk stepped out from their porches as the first olive-drab truck crested the hill, sunlight glinting off the metal helmets of the guards who sat rigid in the back. Behind the wire mesh of the truck stood the prisoners, gray uniforms, hollow eyes, faces that had forgotten youth. Some stared blankly at the fields, others at the sky, as if trying to recognize the sun of a foreign land. Among them was one man, younger than most, Carl Weiss, 24, a mechanic from Bremen. His hands, once blackened by factory grease, now gripped the wooden rail of the truck. He didn't look up when they stopped. John Miller was already waiting by his fence. His son, 8 years old, clung to his sleeve, peering through the slats. The boy had seen pictures in newspapers, soldiers in helmets, faces twisted by rage. But these men looked different. They looked small, beaten down by distance more than defeat. A jeep pulled ahead of the convoy, its engine sputtering before coming to a halt. An American sergeant stepped out, wiping sweat from his neck. "Morning, Miller," he said, with a nod that carried duty rather than greeting. "Got orders to drop a few of them here. They'll help with harvest till winter." John said nothing at first. His eyes moved from the sergeant to the men in the truck to the one standing nearest, Carl. The young German's face was expressionless, but his eyes flickered with something fragile. Expectation, maybe, or dread. The guard handed John a folded paper. "He's yours for the season," he said simply. "Feed him, work him, send him back when we call." John took it, eyes still fixed on Carl. The wind moved between them, dry and restless. Finally, John gestured toward the barn. "You understand work?" he asked. Carl nodded once, quietly.
As the convoy rattled away, the dust rose and settled around them, farmer and prisoner, American and German, bound not by ideology, but by soil, hunger, and the faint hum of a broken tractor waiting to be fixed. Carl's first day on the farm passed beneath an unrelenting sun. The fields stretched out like a living ocean, endless and golden, whispering in the wind. His shirt clung to his back and dust coated his tongue until he could barely swallow. Every movement was cautious, not because of exhaustion, but because he still didn't know what these people might do to him. In his mind, the films played again, the ones they showed back in Bremen, in dim halls filled with soldiers and smoke. Americans, they said, were brutal men who laughed while shooting prisoners, who fed them like animals and made them dig their own graves. The music in those reels had been sharp, triumphant, almost joyful in its cruelty. But when Carl looked up from the field, he saw none of that. The farmer's wife, slender, in a faded blue dress, a strand of hair fallen from her bun, was walking toward him. She carried a tin cup and a small pitcher. The guard sat under a tree, smoking, not paying attention. She stopped a few paces away, her expression unreadable, and poured him water. Carl froze. His pulse quickened. For a moment, he thought it was a trick, some strange American punishment. But she only held out the cup. He hesitated before taking it, eyes flicking toward the guards. She didn't speak, only nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the house. The water was cool. It slid down his throat with the taste of mercy he couldn't explain. That evening, as the sky turned amber and the cicadas began their low song, Carl sat outside the barn. From the farmhouse came the faint clatter of dishes, then laughter, the kind that rises suddenly, naturally, between people who trust one another. It felt unreal hearing such warmth in a world that had taught him to see only division. He lay down on the rough hay, staring at the rafters. His mind fought with itself, one voice whispering caution, the other curiosity. If these were the monsters he had been warned about, why did they share their water? Why did the woman glance at him not with hatred, but with a kind of quiet pity? Outside, the moon rose over the plains, soft and indifferent. Somewhere far away, his homeland was being bombed again. Cities turned to ash. He thought of his mother's kitchen, her voice, the way she had pressed bread into his hand before he left. For the first time in months, Carl felt something that frightened him more than captivity, the possibility that the enemy might have a soul, too.
He turned over, listening to the faint laughter drifting through the walls, and wondered which version of the world was true, the one he'd been taught or the one unfolding, gently, right in front of him. The morning began with the sharp cry of metal, a grinding, choking sound that shattered the quiet like a wounded animal. John Miller slammed his hand against the side of the tractor, muttering under his breath. The engine coughed once more, sputtered, and died. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted upward and disappeared into the pale sky. For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind moving through the corn. The season was running thin. Every wasted hour meant less harvest, less food. John took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow, and stared at the machine as if willing it back to life. Behind him, Carl was stacking bales of hay under the guard's supervision. The sound of the dying engine caught his ear, deep, mechanical, familiar. Without thinking, he straightened, listening to the rhythm of failure. It was the kind of sputtering he had heard 100 times before in workshops along the Rhine. He hesitated, The guard looked bored, not hostile, the rifle slung low. John cursed again, kicked the wheel, and turned away. Carl took a careful step forward. "Sir," he said quietly, his accent thick but words clear. "Carburetor, it is flooding." John turned, his face unreadable. The silence between them was heavier than words. Carl gestured toward the engine. "I can fix," he said. Then softer, "Maybe." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The air was thick with the unspoken, distrust, pride, exhaustion. Finally, John nodded once, curtly, as if conceding to practicality more than trust. Carl climbed up, rolled his sleeves, and lifted the hood. His hands moved with a mechanic's memory, careful, efficient, almost tender. He loosened bolts, drained fuel, adjusted valves, humming faintly under his breath. The sound of his German tune made the guards exchange glances, but John said nothing. He just watched. Minutes passed. Sweat traced the curve of Carl's neck, dust clinging to his skin. Then, with one last adjustment, he pressed the ignition. The engine coughed, hesitated, and roared back to life. John's eyes widened slightly. The guards whistled low. Carl stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers, his face expressionless. The old tractor purred as if it had never been broken. For the first time, John's gaze softened. He didn't smile, not yet, but the edge of suspicion in his eyes dulled. He extended his hand halfway, then stopped, awkward, unsure of the gesture's weight. Instead, he nodded. "Good work," he said simply.
Carl nodded back. No salute, no words, just a silent acknowledgement between two men who had finally found something they both understood, the stubborn heart of a machine and the quiet language of usefulness. The guards moved off, the wind picked up, and the tractor rolled forward again. For the first time, the farm didn't feel divided by sides, only by work left to do. That night, the rain came suddenly, a hard, relentless downpour that hammered the roof of the barn like fists of cold water. The storm rolled in without warning, swallowing the horizon in gray. Inside, Carl sat on a pile of hay, pulling the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders. Each drop that slipped through the broken shingles landed on his skin like a quiet reminder of where he stood, halfway between punishment and mercy. Through the crack of the barn door, he could see the faint glow of the farmhouse window. Shadows moved behind the curtains, the farmer's wife clearing bushes, the boy running to fetch kindling, John leaning in his chair, rubbing his temples. It was a small world, but it was warm. Carl could almost feel it, even from here. A loud gust tore through the barn. Water streamed down in rivulets. Carl tried shifting his blanket, but the hay was soaked, his clothes heavy. He pressed his back to the wall and stared at the flicker of light from the farmhouse, thinking of his mother's kitchen, the way she'd hum as rain pattered against their tin roof back in Bremen. That memory, once comforting, now felt like a wound. Minutes later, the barn door opened with a creak. John stood there, a lantern in hand, the rain sheeting down behind him. His coat was soaked through. For a second, neither spoke. The only sound was the hiss of the storm and the hum of the lantern flame. "Come on," John said finally, his voice flat. Not kind, not cold, just decided. Carl hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. He looked at the guard's post in the distance, empty now. "I stay here, it's fine." But John had already turned toward the house. "No man sleeps in a puddle," he muttered, not waiting to see if Carl followed. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and bread. The warmth hit Carl like a shock. He stood dripping by the doorway, unsure where to look. The woman glanced at him, said nothing, and pointed to a small bed near the stove, freshly made, a folded blanket at the foot. John set the lantern down. "You'll sleep there tonight," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Don't touch the radio, don't leave the room."
Carl nodded, still standing. He didn't know if this was kindness or control, a trap or a test. But when he lay down, the mattress soft beneath him, exhaustion took him fast. The rain drummed steady against the window, like a rhythm of something human returning. In the morning, the storm had passed. The fields glittered with dew. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, and for the first time in a long time, Carl woke not as a prisoner, but simply as a man who had been allowed to sleep dry. Days began to blur into one another, the kind of blur that only peace can make. The guard stopped visiting as often. The farm found its rhythm again, as if war existed only somewhere beyond the horizon. Carl rose before dawn, same as the millers, washing at the pump before the rooster crowed. He worked in silence at first, fixing tools, tightening bolts, patching fences. But silence has a way of softening when shared. Soon words began to slip between them, simple, hesitant ones. Hammer. Milk. Good. The boy, Sam, taught him English with the bluntness only a child can offer. Not hammer, he'd say, giggling. Hammer. Carl laughed once, startled by the sound of his own voice. At midday, the farmer's wife would bring lunch out to the fields. Cornbread, cold beans, sometimes an apple. She never spoke much, just placed the tin pail near Carl's tools and nodded. But that nod was more trust than any speech could carry. In the evenings, the three of them, John, Carl, and the boy, repaired the fence by the west pasture. The wood creaked, nails bent, the hammer thudded in the twilight air. Sometimes John would hum an old hymn. Sometimes Carl answered with a tune from home. Something slow and sad but not hopeless. The melodies would cross paths in the air for a moment, before drifting apart again. Each day suspicion thinned, replaced by the simple intimacy of routine. Carl began leaving the barn door open at night. John stopped counting his tools. The guards didn't bother to check. There was humor too, small, human misfires that bridged the gap faster than any apology could do. One morning, the farmer's wife offered Carl pie. He blinked, frowned, and pointed at a pigeon outside the window. Pie? He asked, puzzled. She laughed until she cried. John shook his head, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. By late summer, Carl had learned the rhythm of the land. When to move irrigation lines before the sun hit, when the soil was ready for seed, when to listen to the sky. John stopped calling him the German. He just called him Carl. It wasn't friendship, not yet. Something quieter, simpler. Mutual dependence, born from the same dirt and the same fatigue. At night, Carl would sit on the porch steps after work, watching the horizon fade from gold to blue. Inside, the family moved about. Dishes, footsteps, laughter. It no longer sounded foreign. The war, for a few hours each day, seemed like something that belonged to another world, one ruled by pride and noise. Here, there was only the steady rhythm of breathing, of work, of decency growing in small, ordinary gestures. And it was in those gestures that Carl began to feel something strange and almost dangerous: peace. The first cool winds of autumn had begun to roll in when Carl asked, almost shyly, for a piece of paper. John looked at him for a long moment, then nodded toward the kitchen desk. "Take one," he said simply. It was the first time Carl had been allowed inside alone. He sat at the table, the smell of flour and wood polish around him, and pressed the pencil's point to the paper. The words came slowly, uncertainly, each one like a step across a river whose depth he couldn't see. "Dear Mutter," he wrote, "I am far from home, but I am alive. They do not hate us here." Outside, the sun lay soft on the fields, bending through the window onto the floorboards. The boy was playing with a toy truck near the stove, his laughter faint. Carl paused, looking at the sound, realizing how long it had been since he'd heard a child laugh without fear. He wrote about the farm, about fixing the tractor, about the American man who didn't speak much but kept his word. He drew a small picture of the machine he'd repaired, beside it a rough sketch of the farmer's dog sleeping under the porch. His handwriting wobbled, more from emotion than from lack of skill. The work is hard, but honest. When it rains, they let me sleep inside. Sometimes they give me pie, not pigeon. He smiled faintly at the memory. I think of home less with sorrow now, more with hope. He folded the letter neatly, sealing it as though sealing a confession. That evening, when John came in from the fields, Carl handed him the letter. If you can send, he said. John took it wordlessly, tucking it into his coat pocket. But the next morning the world reminded them both how fragile peace could be. As Carl walked into town with John to deliver grain, two men stood outside the feed store, neighbors, their faces weathered by work and resentment. One spat on the ground when they passed. Didn't think you'd be keeping company with a Nazi, Miller, one said. John stopped, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer. The other man chuckled. Guess you forgot who your boy's fighting, huh?
The silence was heavy. Carl stood still, hands at his sides, eyes fixed on the dust. He knew this rhythm, humiliation disguised as patriotism. But this time, he wasn't the only one enduring it. John finally spoke, his voice calm but edged. He fixes what's broken, he said. That's more than most. The men looked away first. That night, John dropped the letter at the post office without a word, and when he came home, he found Carl sitting on the porch steps, staring at the stars, the same stars that hung over Bremen, over every soldier and farmer and mother praying for the same quiet thing, a world where a letter didn't need to cross an ocean to find its humanity. The peace they'd built was fragile, like frost on glass, beautiful, but breakable at the slightest touch. It shattered one morning in late October. A jeep came tearing down the dirt road, tires kicking up clouds of dust. The guards hadn't been seen for weeks, but now they were back, rifles slung, faces tight. John and Carl were by the fence line, repairing a post when the engine's growl reached them. Carl froze. The sound carried the weight of authority, of chains rattling back to life. The jeep skidded to a stop beside the farmhouse. The sergeant climbed out, boots heavy on the ground. One of the Germans escaped last night, he said without greeting, from Miller's neighbor's farm. We're searching every property. John glanced toward Carl, then back at the sergeant. You think he came here? Don't know, the sergeant replied, but protocol says we check. You been keeping yours accounted for? John's voice stayed steady. He's been working right here. Carl stood still, the hammer still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew the rules. Any missing man meant suspicion on them all. He'd seen what protocol could mean in other places, other uniforms. The sergeant motioned for another guard to search the barn. They went through everything: tools, hay, the bedroll Carl slept on. The sound of rummaging filled the silence. Carl said nothing. Neither did John. Finally, the sergeant turned back. If you're hiding one of them, it'll go hard on you, Miller. John met his gaze, calm but unyielding. There's no one here but him, and he hasn't gone anywhere. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the guard emerged from the barn, shaking his head. Clear. The sergeant lingered, as if the truth itself irritated him. You trust this one too much, he muttered. John's reply was quiet, almost weary. Maybe that's the point. The jeep left in a roar of engines, fading down the road until the sound dissolved into wind again.
Carl let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You could have said nothing," he murmured. John adjusted his hat. "Wouldn't have been true." They went back to the fence, the silence between them no longer awkward, just full, like a shared secret. The hammer struck wood again. That evening, Carl repaired the barn door the guards had broken. John stood nearby, handing him nails. The routine felt heavier now, as if trust had cost something, but neither man seemed to regret paying it. When the work was done, John looked at the repaired door, then at Carl. "You do good work," he said. Carl nodded, eyes lowered. "You do good trust." And in that fragile exchange, half language, half silence, the line between prisoner and protector disappeared entirely. Winter crept into Texas quietly that year, like an old memory settling over the land. The mornings came pale and cold, and the fields, once golden, now lay bare under a sheet of frost. Inside the barn, Carl sat near the small stove, holding a thin envelope written in German script. The guards had finally distributed months of delayed mail. It was from his mother. Her words trembled across the page. The house bombed, neighbors gone, the city starving. Yet she still called him Manyunga, my boy, as if time had not stretched oceans between them. John's wife, Mary, found him there, staring at the letter as if it were made of glass. She didn't speak German, but she understood the look in his eyes. Quiet grief needed no translation. She set down a mug of coffee beside him, steaming and dark. "Bad news?" she asked softly. Carl hesitated, then shook his head. "News," he said simply. "Just news." Later that afternoon, John received his own letter, this one from his brother in France, a soldier still stationed near the Rhine. The letter was blunt, almost cruel in its exhaustion. "We saw what they did. Don't forget what they are."
He folded it carefully and set it aside, but the words clung to him like smoke. That evening, as Carl worked quietly, mending a gate, John stood watching him, torn between what he'd read and what he'd come to know. Under the dim orange light of dusk, Carl looked up and spoke first. "Your brother, he's still fighting?" John nodded. "Yeah, he'll be home soon." Carl's hands paused. "You will be glad." John studied him for a long time, then said, "If he comes home, yes. But I don't think anyone really comes home from war." Carl looked down again, tightening a wire. "No," he whispered. "We just change borders inside ourselves." The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. The kind of silence that understood loss on both sides. That night, Mary found John sitting by the window, the letter from his brother open beside a cup of untouched coffee. "You thinking about him?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "About both of them," he said. Outside, the barn light glowed faintly. Carl still awake, perhaps riding back to the ruins he once called home. John stared out at that single light, small against the winter dark. "Funny," he murmured. "The more I know about him, the less he feels like the enemy." Mary placed her hand on his shoulder. "Maybe that's the real war ending." And in that moment, quiet, domestic, ordinary, the front lines of hate and history blurred just a little more. 2 men, 2 letters, 2 homes, both broken, both believing in return. Spring returned to the farm with its slow mercy. The frost melted, and the field stirred awake again, green blades pushing through soil that had known both peace and prisoners. The war in Europe was ending. Rumors moved faster than the wind. Germany had fallen. The men in gray would soon be going home, though few still knew what home meant anymore. One evening, the guards arrived earlier than usual. Papers were signed, names checked. Karl's was among them. He would leave at sunrise. The news should have brought relief. Instead, it left him hollow like a field after harvest. After supper, John walked to the barn. Karl was packing what little he owned: a letter, a torn photograph, a few tools he had been allowed to keep. The air between them was thick with what neither could say. John cleared his throat. "You fixed a lot around here." "Tractor runs smoother than ever." Karl smiled faintly. "Machines are easier than people." John looked at him for a long moment. "Not always." He stepped aside, motioning toward the house. "Come with me, just for tonight." Karl followed him, uncertain. Inside, the farmhouse was warm, filled with the smell of bread and wood smoke. John led him down the hall to a small room. On the bed lay clean sheets, folded neatly. "It's yours for the night," John said quietly. "No more barn." Karl froze, eyes wide. You mean I sleep here?" John nodded. "You earned it." For a long moment, Karl stood motionless. He had imagined many endings: escape, punishment, even death, but never this. Never being offered the bed of the man whose country he had been told to hate. He sat down slowly, fingers brushing the quilt as if it might vanish. "In my country, we were told Americans had no hearts." John half smiled. "Guess they were wrong about some things." Later, Mary placed a small lamp by the door. "Good night, Karl," she said gently. He couldn't answer. His throat had closed around the weight of gratitude. That night, Karl didn't sleep much. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of life inside the house, the creak of wood, the murmur of voices, the fragile sound of peace. When morning came, the guards returned. Karl shook John's hand, firm but trembling. "Thank you," he said, in English, his accent soft. John nodded, eyes lowered. "Take care of yourself." As the truck rolled away down the dirt road, Karl looked back once more, at the farmhouse, the field, the man, the bed that ended the war, inside him. He would remember that room forever, not for comfort, but for what it meant, that even in the ruins of a world divided by hate, a single act of trust could still build a bridge, soft as a bedsheet, strong as forgiveness.